Hello, and welcome to David Starkey Talks. Today, I am going to commit lèse-majesté. I am going to talk about the great she-elephant of British politics, Sue Gray. You know, the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, who is paid more than the Prime Minister, because, as we all know, elephants, like civil servants, are very, very hierarchical creatures. Well, she's let her little protégé, the Prime Minister, go all by himself to the Labour Party conference. He hasn't yet actually dared to open his mouth, but presumably she's written the speech for him. Meantime, she is skulking back in her natural habitat, the garden of Downing Street, where she was photographed a few days ago having a very bitter altercation with the Prime Minister's permanent private secretary, the head of his inner office, allegedly about people weren't quite able to lip read, but they came pretty near it, and they certainly frown read. She has a very formidable frown about the status of the SPADs, that's to say the Labour Party special advisors, parachuted into Downing Street, who, unlike her, have not benefited from enhanced salaries, and indeed it's rumoured in many cases haven't even been given a salary at all, which does of course create a little bit of trouble. Anyway, as I said, she's retired to her natural habitat during the Labour Party conference of the Downing Street garden, despite the fact that in the report, the famous report, the Grey Report, the 50 Shades of Grey report, she wrote on Partygate, she said very firmly that the Downing Street garden shouldn't be used for the kind of meeting which she had just had, which she has just had. Dear me, tripping over of tongues. I could be practically giving a speech at the Labour Party conference, justifying how I've received, no, we don't talk about gifts, general benefactions from that kindly soul, the sugar daddy of the all-purpose sugar daddy. Ask and it shall be given, knock and it shall be opened, takes the waiting out of wanting, Lord Wahid Ali, known originally, of course, by private eye as Lord Wahid Boy. Anyway, we begin to lose track in all of this, but there she is in the Downing Street garden, which he said should be used strictly by the Prime Minister and his family, but there we are. Times change, memories slip, don't they? Anyway, sleeping, as I suppose, I gather I had to look it up on Wikipedia, like everything else, where I gather elephants, even great she-elephants, sleep standing up, presumably propped against one of the favourite trees in the garden, or apparently they can do it just putting their trunks down and propping themselves up on that. Anyway, so there is Sue. Now, why is this woman so important? Why is she the great she-elephant? Why did Starmer take her as Chief of Staff? Why did she accept? Why is she an object of fear, of deep dislike, of, I would say, deeply disturbing figure? A figure that really shouldn't belong in the world of democratic politics, has a place, a very obvious place, in governments that are run on profoundly anti-democratic principles. She would have been entirely at home. We'd have had to change gender, but what's that between friends nowadays? She would have been entirely at home in the subject that I really do specialise in, the court of Henry VIII. So what is she doing? Why does she have this power? Why does the sweet little man, Oliver Letwin, who used to act as Cabinet Office Minister back in another one of her little boys who was allowed occasional freedom, who was Cabinet Office Minister back in the days of the coalition government of David Cameron with Nick Clegg and so on, he described her as a woman who really runs the country, then and now. What is the clue to this? Who is she? What is she? What does she do? What did she do? I think the key is, very quickly, she's born. We don't actually talk about a woman of mystery. We don't even know the precise year. Is it 57? is it 58, to apparently Irish immigrants living in London. It comes from the border between the Republic and Northern Ireland, I think near Newry. Anyway, she's born in 57, 58, and she goes directly into the civil service from school, no university. I'm not even sure. Did she do A-levels? I've no idea. Quite unknown. In other words, the most striking thing in one sense is this is a woman of no education whatever. Roger Scruton said it was an experiment of as yet unproven success, that John Major was our first Prime Minister without an education. Well, Sue Gray, I think, is, I would take an absolutely certain bet, our first senior civil servant without an education. So she's not policy. Starmer didn't want her for policy. She is the manager of the machine. She is the manipulator, the mover around. Anyway, she has a moderately distinguished career in the civil service, but nobody really had ever heard of her, and she didn't much matter until, again, under the coalition, in 2012, she was appointed as the director of, listen to this, we've talked about it before a bit, Propriety and Ethics, which is a new and newish and burgeoning division within the Cabinet Office, which is a central machine of government that literally includes Downing Street, the garden, and the adjacent offices on either side, in Horse Guards Road to the left as you're actually looking at Downing Street, and then going round the corner into the old Privy Council offices in Whitehall. All this lot is interlinked. There are internal means of communication, especially between Downing Street and the offices in Whitehall, where the man in theoretical charge of all this, the Cabinet Secretary, has his office complete with waiting room, conference room and everything else. We're going to be talking about that. Once again, locations are very important. Anyway, what is propriety and ethics? Well, it basically goes back to two things. There's a general idea and there's a specific set of circumstances. The general idea goes back to the wonderfully self-ennobled Peter Hennessy, former BBC's political correspondent, who came up with this idea that the idea of good chaps government no longer works. Once upon a time, Parliament, indeed the civil service and public life, essentially disciplined themselves. If you were found out in the business of lying to Parliament, as with Profumo, you resigned and endured a life of public humiliation until you worked your passage back. But anyway, in our modern world, our modern shameless world, in which people can be shamed for nothing, and therefore shame has by and large lost its significance, the good chaps theory no longer works. So you have to have rules. Remember that word, rules. This is the thing, above all, that links Starmer and Gray. They are passionate believers in rules. They think life should be run by rules. And if you obey the letter of the rules, that is all right. And principles, spirit, dear me, law doesn't have a spirit in this world. Law simply has the letter. And Starmer and Gray are really good at the letter of the law, but they haven't the wit, the imagination, the political sensitivity, the human sensitivity to recognise that there's a thing called the spirit. And this is the problem, of course, with government by rules. If you try and establish everything by rules, then it isn't a question of behaving well. That's too difficult. It's just a question of following the rules. And providing you follow the rules, like, for example, most of the time, Paula Venables, however incompetent you are, however malign you are, you simply rise ever upwards until perhaps there's a terrible moment, as there was with Paula, when the bubble burst. That emphatically has not happened yet with Sue Gray. I would expect it's coming pretty quickly. Nor yet with Keir Starmer, though I think it'll come quite quickly with him as well. Anyway, that's the idea, the shift from good chaps theory to rules. And then there's a specific element of the principles of public life, the absurd principles of public life that specify, for example, that politicians shouldn't act out of ambition, that politicians should be impartial in a party political system. Needless to say, put together by that wonderful figure of fun. Is he Lord Justice Nolan? I imagine he must be. Anyway, it's called the Nolan Principles, and they're as silly as most judicial interventions in politics, which is why back in the day, when the foundations of the excellence of Anglo-British government were laid with the Bill of Rights of 1689, a very careful division was made between law and government, which, needless to say, the Blair years deliberately broke down. But anyway, so the Nolan Principles and these absurd principles are the backbone of the propriety and the ethics. It's very difficult, actually, to tell the difference between the two of them, but I suppose the doubling up sounds good. It's called indenture English, the propriety and the ethics, which is managed by this division, of which Sue was given control in 2012. Now, what does it actually do as opposed to pontificate? You might think in that sort of description I've given, it merely pontificates. How wrong you would be. It is, in fact, been trying to think of an easy way of describing it. It's now the Uber HR, Human Resources Department, of the entire machinery, not simply of government, but public life. It even supervises the disciplinary procedures of both houses of Parliament. The alleged, remember, MPs no longer discipline themselves as a parliamentary regulator. We all have regulators. Rules in this world we're talking about have regulators, and the machinery of common supervision, which was used to destroy Boris Johnson, for example, more of that anon. Sue Gray was very much involved in that too. And the machinery of commons regulation falls under propriety and ethics, as does the business. Vitally important, the Prime Ministers of patronage to all public appointments, to the civil service itself. And of course, Sue Gray's knowledge came incredibly useful when Labour comes along and parachutes in special advisors, donors. The Lord Alley, I mean, she signs off the Lord Alley's pass into Downing Street. So propriety and ethics deals with that enormous area of public appointments, and of course controlling HOLAC, the appointments committed to the House of Lords. It enables you to control one of the most, not simply forms of patronage, but also not simply for yourself, it actually enables you to act as a veto on other people. Oh, terribly useful. I can just see, for example, how this machinery is going to be used to destroy financially, at any rate, Nigel Farage. Once you start introducing rules about what MPs can and cannot do, it will, I think, is a racing certainty that it will be ruled that Farage's role, and indeed that of other MPs, other Reform MPs at GB News, is ultra vires, is in practice illegal, and they will be forced to choose between their income from and their role at GB News and their seats. Anyway, so it's this extraordinarily powerful role. It goes even beyond that. So it controls the whole business of appointments to the civil service, not to the armed forces, of course, but to the civil service, to that huge number of quangos. All those go through its hands, to the House of Lords, the more and more the management, the disciplinary management of the House of Commons, and then it has some really rather dark functions. It controls the honours system. It controls and This is entirely respectable. The grant of honours, there are special committees doing this for various areas of public life, the arts, business, and so on. But it also has got a special machinery called the Honours Forfeiture Committee, which removes honours and does so by rather dark processes. It can receive anonymous delation, or at least the person, and I know this from personal experience, the person whose honour it is proposed to be stripped isn't told who his accusers are. He may see their accusations, but who they are, what their status is, whether they bear malice against him, no. Also, the grounds for the removal of honours are deeply mysterious. Yes, criminality. Yes, professional disbarment. But there is this wonderful phrase, bringing into disrepute, which, like the bed of Procrustes, can be stretched in any direction. So this was what Paul Evans, this is what, she was a rightful victim of it. This is what Sue Gray ran. And she ran it for 6 years, from 2012 to 2018. As you can see, in short, she is the woman who knows where all the bodies are. She has managed every scandal. Scandals of Tory ministers, Andrew Mitchell, and Bitegate, where he swore at the policeman, Damien Green, and his alleged viewing of pornography. He was found guilty. His viewing of pornography on his official computer. She handled all of that, which is why little Oliver Letwin said she really ran the show. But you can see what this is again. This is merely personal manipulation. So, where does then this get us to the most famous moment in her life? Well, of course, the most famous moment in her life is the Gray Report, which is produced after Partygate. Now, Partygate itself has been used as an absolute defining line. It's very interesting. The Labour Party conference today, the speech of Lucy Powell, who is the leader of the House of Commons, was all about trying to draw a line between their little peccadillos, as I said, the fact that they've been bankrolled by an all-purpose sugar daddy, Lord Alley, and the genuine wickedness of the Conservatives. And of course, Partygate came in a very big way. And let's never forget, Lucy Powell declaimed, if she could declaim, they changed the law so we couldn't socialise while secretly partying themselves and then lying to Parliament about it for months. Yah, boo, hiss. Boris. Well, Sue indeed produced the report that is the basis of that remark. But it's very interesting, and I want now just quickly to go back and look at that report. The press at the time, of course, was determined to get Boris, as were even increasingly his own Tory MPs. And there was the famous birthday party where they ate bits of cake and drank a cup or two of tea, and maybe the odd beer in the Cabinet Office, and there was rather less documented thing at Christmas, and so on. But can we just pause gently? As a result of the investigations, documentation accumulated by Sue Gray and the subsequent investigations by the Metropolitan Police, no fewer than 126 people received the penalty notices, in other words, the fine for breaking lockdown regulations. 126. Yes, Boris was one of them. Yes, it was genuine indignation. Sunak was another. He'd merely turned up early to a meeting, in an actual meeting in the cabinet room, which is why he found himself involved in the early stages, presumably the later stages rather, of that little birthday party that we're talking about. But 126. So whereas everybody focused on the politicians, and that's what, of course, Lucy Powell wants us to think about, change the law so that we couldn't socialise. By the way, can we just gently remind ourselves, the Labour Party, led by a certain Keir Starmer, was the most passionately in favour of such rules. They clamoured for the government to lock down longer, lock down harder, exclude more and more things, shut more and more schools, and all the rest of it. So if we were actually looking at who was responsible for the banning of socialising, well, the opposition bears a significant degree of responsibility too. But you can see now, it's not conservative politicians, not 126 conservative politicians. I can say quite definitely, not a single other politician, apart from Sunak and apart from Boris himself, was involved in Partygate. So this vision of the heart of the Tory party heartlessly carousing as grannies died is simply, let's call it by its proper name, a deliberately propagated lie. Who was carousing in Downing Street? Well, I've talked about this before. I talked about it back at the time that the Grey Report was published, but nobody was interested. Everybody just wanted to get Boris. But suddenly, with the role of Sue herself being now very much in, as it were, everybody's focus, and the role of other civil servants, because as we know, I've talked about the Starmer state as effectively a late Soviet state with a nomenclatura in which, of course, the high civil service is a part of this structure, the extraordinarily close-knit relationship between the Labour Party, the civil service, the quangocracy, the universities, and so on. All of this, I think, needs taking apart a bit. So shall we look at who the organisers, the guilty parties, we'll use that word because they were, of the two most flagrant parties were? Well, there was a party, let me get my dates right, there's a party very much around Boris's birthday on the 18th of June 2020. This is a party, interestingly enough, it is actually held in the, we talked about the cabinet secretary's office. It's held in his waiting room and I think the adjacent conference room. The earlier stages of it are briefly attended by the then cabinet secretary, Sir Mark Sedwell, who says to those organising the party, for God's sake, don't make too much of a mess, which I'm afraid was advice, or indeed an order, that wasn't entirely followed. The party, and this is the 18th of June, remember, right at the height of the thing, height of lockdown, the party involved suitcases of alcohol. There was a karaoke machine. As the party went on far into the night, people were sick. They tend to be. A couple of chaps got overheated and squared up. One version of the story that I've heard even has them taking their shirts off. So they're sick. They're squaring up. They are absolutely boozy and drunk out of their heads and raucous. There's a karaoke machine. Who organised that party? Well, her name is Helen McNamara. To repeat, Helen McNamara. Do you know who she was at that point? She was Sue Gray's successor as head of Propriety and Ethics. So the woman responsible for for the whole of that formidable machine, that machine of censorship, that quasi-Stasi at the heart of government, organised the most rowdy party. And there's another little element to this story which I don't think has been fully picked up, that karaoke machine. What on earth are senior civil servants doing having access to karaoke machines? Well, an acquaintance of mine who was a Conservative cabinet minister at the point and very familiar with the workings of the cabinet office told me, with no attempt at, as it were, this is in confidence, that the karaoke machine belonged to a certain Sue Gray herself. Let that sink in. I think it sort of fits because her husband, Sue Gray's husband, Bill Conlon, is a country singer. So obviously, that sort of musical equipment is likely to be around. So the current head of Propriety and Ethics in 2020 organises this party with equipment, it would seem, it would appear. I'm not tweeting, so I'm probably not going to be arrested. With equipment supplied by the former head of Propriety and Ethics and the current, what is she, Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister and General Enforcer. And you wonder perhaps why there is ill feeling with her fellow civil servants. And then there was another one, because we haven't really finished, at just before Christmas, on the 17th of December 2020, there was another very raucous, very drunken, very boozy party, once again held in its favourite location, the location of the waiting room of the Cabinet Secretary, who by this point is now Simon Case. And who was that party held for? Well, organised by, well, isn't it interesting? A woman called Kate Joseph. Who was Kate Joseph? Who is Kate Joseph? Well, she is, believe it or not, she was the head of the COVID task force. So when the Labour Party denounces the wicked Tories for having imposed clampdown and partied away in defiance and mockery of the sufferings of the British people, well, the chief partier in December 2020 was the actual woman who would have drafted and enforced the legislation. What this shows, of course, is the absolute contempt of the inner circle of government for us poor saps. Manifestly, the whole business of lockdown was one huge, sustained, absurd, face-saving lie. And the fact that a supposed scientist like Chris Whitty backed it so convincingly is a disgrace. We all know the consequences in terms of the health of the nation, the employability and attitude to work of the nation, the education of our children, the structures of the NHS, the patterns of work of the civil service, the public finances. Lockdown was catastrophic to them all. And the woman who was at the heart of its administration, Kate Joseph, parted the night away with drunken friends. So that's the world of Sue Gray. That's the world, and as you can imagine, the tensions. Because, for example, let's just put the final little thing in place, shall we? Let's just put the final little thing in place. The person who should have done the report was, of course, Simon Case, the Cabinet Secretary, head of the Civil Service. But he, of course, had a little party too. Little office quiz. Actually, it looked quite innocuous. Genuinely, people were there because they were there from work, minimum alcohol, and so on. But he honourably recused himself. Now, I am not at any point saying Gray herself was involved in any of these parties. Let me make it quite clear. But if she supplied and I put that if there, if she supplied the karaoke machine for the party on the 18th of June, she must have known what it would be used for. To repeat, she must have known what it would be used for. Is it any wonder there are the tensions? Is it any wonder there's resentment? Is it any wonder that the great she-elephant is skulking safely in Downing Street, whilst poor little Sir Keir tries to manage things? And my next video, I'm going to look at why poor little Sir Keir will not be able to manage things.